get started with how to paint wildflowers easy. As an acrylic landscape painter, I'm always looking for those great big shapes to draw when I begin a painting. One of the main design aspects of this image is the silhouette of trees that border around those beautiful wildflowers. The focal point on this painting are the wildflowers, and for that reason I put the flowers on an angle across this canvas, giving it a lot more energy than if it were straight across. Another part of the design of this painting are the trees on the outer edges of the left and the right of the canvas. These create a frame that we look past towards the trees and past those wildflowers and to the mountains in the distance. This creates a lot of depth. Before I started drawing, I painted the background with pyrrole orange and a little bit of quinacridone red. I put it on very thinly with GAC 500, which is an acrylic medium. When that paint was dry, I took a nice soupy mixture of the quinacridone red, and that is what I'm drawing with. And I like to draw with a flat brush, so it's a long handle flat brush so I can back up. And I'm looking for all the big shapes and trying to keep it fairly simple. You can see that I have third marks on my canvas and some crosshairs. This helps me to replace the drawing more easily. It also allows me to think about thirds and thirds of thirds so that as I place elements like the tips of the trees or the mountains or the flowers, I can move things around so they're in pleasing areas on the canvas. My goal is to avoid splitting things in half or to have boring increments. You want to have varied spaces between all your elements. Here I'm applying the dioxazine purple that's been mixed with GAC 500. I'm applying it with a triangular palette knife, and occasionally I'll cut into that wet paint with a color shaper just to push the paint around and make the marks more interesting. As I apply the marks, I try to think about how things grow. So I go in the shape of the trees or the movement of the growth of the trees or bushes. And to do the background trees, I let myself know where the vertical parts are first and then grow the tree out from there. The dioxazine purple looks a little darker and duller against that yellow-orange. As I applied this layer of purple color, I made sure to allow little bits of the background to show through and not to go too dark. For the next section, I tinted some ultramarine blue, some dioxazine purple, and I also tinted some phthalo blue. So what I'm going to do in the background between the trees and behind the trees is first put a layer of that tint of ultramarine blue, and then above it for the more distant mountains it'll be a tint of the dioxazine purple, and then for the sky to make it a little bit brighter it is the phthalo blue with a bit of white. If you're giving this painting a try, have a lot of fun with those little marks between the trees. That's what makes a painting look quite dynamic and interesting, is all those different little marks that you see that contrast against the bigger areas. When painting an acrylic landscape painting, make sure that you're allowing the texture and the contrast of thicker paint against the thinner paint. So the paint in the dark trees is a little bit thinner and the background paint that with the whites a little bit thicker. The part on how to paint wildflowers is coming up. It's interesting how we need to have a framework or a contrast to make the focal point work. So all that we're doing right now is creating that for those wildflowers. It's going to be all about them in the end. Painting edges on landscape paintings is very important, so whenever you get to an edge, whether it's the edge of a mountain, make it look like there might be little trees poking up, or make the curve of the mountain look correct. And when you take two edges and bring them together, decide if you want a soft edge or a hard edge. I want these edges to be soft so that everything sits back behind the foreground, so you'll notice that those edges are getting blended into one another. Okay, we're back to the tints of phthalo blue. These will be glazed later with yellow to make green. So we're getting some of those grasses that will go around the wildflowers done first. For the lit edge of the trees, we're going to take chromium green oxide and tint it and use that. That'll be glazed with yellow as well. Okie dokie, so the next part we're going to take chromium oxide green straight from the tube and add it on the left corner where the shadows are, and this will create a nice little foil against the lighter wildflowers. So this is actually the easiest part of the painting and on how to paint wildflowers. We're going to take titanium white and tint all the areas where the pink flowers will be, and these are called fireweed. And the reason why we're going to tint them white first is we want to do a glaze of magenta, which will look a lot brighter than tinting the magenta. To paint the fireweed wildflowers, create triangular shapes in general. To create bits of petals, just do little marks around those triangular shapes. Do your best to leave little bits of the background orange showing through. This will give the illusion of other flowers peeking through, such as Indian paintbrush. To give the feel of additional wildflowers, create some loopy bloopy oval shapes in the bottom left corner. Once all your tints are nice and dry, you can take the magenta, add GAC 500 to it to make it nice and thin, and start layering it over wherever you think the wildflowers are. While you have that magenta glaze, you can go into other places of your painting and put it over top of the bits of orange or purples just to vary the color a little bit more, and also in those distant mountains. To keep those foreground greens nice and bright, we're using Hansa Yellow Light, which is a cool yellow on top of that cool tinted blue. I'm using that same yellow on the right-hand tree, which is in the foreground. Hansa Yellow Medium is a warmer yellow than the Hansa Yellow Light, and I'm using that to tint the background trees and the bottom left corner. This yellow glaze is helping to warm up the painting. To make those foreground wildflowers look a little brighter, add little bits of cadmium orange next to the magenta colors. So for how to paint wildflowers easy, it's easy because we're letting our imagination fill in all the details. We're giving the illusion of lots of growth of grasses and different flowers just by the way we created our brush strokes nice and loose. For this type of acrylic landscape painting, we want to keep the edges loose and interesting. That's what makes it fun. So this is a stage of painting where I push the warms and cools. So I put a little bit of cobalt teal that was tinted with white behind those trees, and just playing around a little bit more with the cadmium orange and little tints of this and that with the magentas and yellows. So I'm also adding little bits of phthalo blue that's been tinted in different areas, re-glazing those. And the last thing I did was add a little bit of glow on the top right. So that's white with the tiniest little bit of yellow in it, just to make it feel like there's something beyond that distant mountain. I felt like the glow needed to be a bit bigger, so I took some of the titanium white, added a tiny bit of pyrrole orange, and scumbled that color a little bit more into the mountains to create more of a glow. It also warms the painting up a little bit more. When doing this type of effect, I like to add the paint, and while it's wet, using a moist paper towel or rag and rubbing a little bit off. The mass silhouette of trees needed to be broken up a little bit, so I took the chromium green oxide, tinted it, and made a couple of little trees there, which I tinted, or I actually glazed with a little bit of yellow once it was dry. Here I want to get a little bit more pink into the foreground, so I added a little bit of white into the right-hand tree, and on that bottom left corner a few little white marks. And once that was dry, glazed that with magenta and made some more flowers. And then on the right-hand tree, I went over that again with some darker colors and made it look more tree-like again. To add this little flower, it's a wet on wet technique. While the paint is still wet, you can add a darker color or whatever you like and scratch into it and make some interesting shapes. Just adding a few more little grasses into the foreground, and I think we are done. I guess we could have called this how to paint trees as well, but you can see how all the background and the foreground was all to make the pink wildflowers pop out in that painting. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe for notice of new videos. Take care.